Hello, everybody. Um, I am recording in the afternoon, so good afternoon to those of you who watch in the afternoon. Um, I'm gonna do episode. What are we up to? Five, I believe, today. And I'm going to cover social cognition. I know I mentioned that I would like very much to get out your final um, writing assignment to you, and I would very much like to get that out. I had some hiccups with Zoom yesterday, which is the program I used to record most of these. So that episode got kind of put back or pushed back, and I look forward to getting that to you, but it's going to have to wait just a little bit longer. Hopefully today, I'm going to actually record both episode 5 and 6, social cognition and traction, and push those out to you guys. So you'll have those. You probably noticed, I'm also living or I'm recording in my living room. And there is one very important reason for that. And I will take you and show you what that reason is. If you walk out my back deck, you'll notice that I have set up um, my ceramic grill, which I have percolating along at a very low temperature. And I have a pork butt that is going to go in very shortly, which takes a bit of time. And so if my family wants to eat tonight, I will have to. I'll pause it. You won't notice that I break off. There'll just be a little break in the action, and I'll just be back at it. But that's why I'm upstairs, so I can keep an eye on my pork situation. Um, so that's what's going on there. Let's jump right in. I'll see if I can't share my screen, and we'll get started. Okay. So we're going to dive right into social cognition. Social cognition is, well, let me get through this first. Social cognition is an interesting creature in that social cognition is it's really not a communication topic per se. Social cognition has a lot more to do with psychology. We're usually, when we talk about social cognition, we're not talking about the sharing back and forth, the transmission, encoding, decoding of messages. Generally speaking, when we think about cognition, we're thinking about stuff that's going on in your brain about the social world around you. So the way you think about different social structures is what social cognition is. Your thoughts about the social world. So we're going to talk about what is social cognition. We're going to talk about some different types of cognitive structures, both schema and um, and event schema or scripts. We'll talk a little bit about biases in relationships and biases about behavior, some self biases, and then finally we'll wrap it up with impression management. By the way, a number of you have asked if I will be posting the PowerPoint slides online. It's not my intention to do that. And the reason that it's not my intention to do that is because at any point you're free to, take notes, pause the videos, and just write things down. You're welcome to do that. But I'm not gonna post the PowerPoint separate from the videos. Okay, so let's dive right in. Social cognition, we've already sort of defined it. It's the way that you think about the social world around you, right? Your thoughts about the social world. Now, that might sound a little bland on up front, and I certainly would understand if you thought that that does sound a little bit boring. Social cognition actually is quite interesting. Once we start to dive into some of the biases that we as humans have about our social world, and I'm hopeful that some of these will be new to you. Some of them you've already thought of. Some of them you've had experience with, or will know they exist. But I'll tell you that I do think that social cognition is it's an interesting thing to talk about. And I recommended that you read this chapter. And really, the most important thing here is this is the reason we're going to talk about social cognition, even though it's not really a communication first topic. The reason that we're going to talk about social cognition is almost all of our messages and actual communication behavior, when it comes to interpersonal communication, is indeed built on and predicated on an understanding of social cognition, right? So while social cognitions themselves are not communication behaviors, almost all of our communication behavior is responsive to, is changed by different social cognitions that we have. Our social cognitions fundamentally alter the way we experience the world. Okay. So, what are these cognitive structures? Let's dive into that. So, schemas and scripts are sort of the first thing I want to talk about. So, schemas, or a set of schemas, pardon me, just had a little problem with my computer. We'll get right back to this. Give me just one moment. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause my recording. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm back now. So what we're going to talk about first are, I should say, schemas. So if you are looking for a definition of schema, and I have to pop this up. What a schema is a well-organized structure of cognition. So a set of thoughts that you can have about some social entity, such as a person, a group, a role, a certain type of event. And these organized structures that we have, help us to develop expectations about what to expect from others' behavior. If you remember back to episode 2, when we were defining interpersonal communication, one of the things that we talked about is that in order to call something truly interpersonal, we have to have enough knowledge of another person with whom we're interacting that that level of knowledge that we have, it makes us, it gives us the opportunity to be able to make predictions about other people, right? If we don't have enough knowledge to really make, some pretty precise predictions about ways that people are going to behave, we can't really be said to have a close interpersonal relationship or even a personal relationship with another person, right? So a schema helps us to develop expectations about what to expect from others' behavior. The reason schemas are important is that schemas help to give us a few mental shortcuts that we can use. So if every time you met a new person, you had absolutely zero idea how that person was going to behave, first of all, meeting new people would be very, very, it'd be an onerous task, right? If every time you met a new person, they behaved in a new, different way, and you couldn't tell if they were going to come up to you and punch you or shake your hand or give you a high five. If all bets would be off every time you met a new person if you couldn't make predictions about them. Fortunately, and this is what schema allow us to do, is to make predictions about people we've not met before, right? and also help us to deal with situations that we're unfamiliar with. Well, there's several different types of schema that I'd like you to know about. First, I'd like you to know about a person schema, a person schema. So a person schema is just a set of cognitive structures that describe the personalities of others, right? It can apply to specific individuals. It can apply to types of individuals. So, for instance, I have a person schema for the way Jen is going to behave, my wife, Jen, right? Um, it's a good thing that I have this schema because otherwise, every time I wake up in the morning, I'm not sure what to expect, right? I've developed this set of cognitive structures about who she is as a person. And so I know that, realistically, if she wakes up at 4 in the morning, she's going to be a little crabby and angry because she's not like super a morning person. I'm even less of a morning person, but she's really not a morning person, right? So I can develop these expectations, these beliefs, really just which is really just a cognitive structure, right? That um, can describe my wife. I also will tell you I have a person schema about Barack Obama, right? And I imagine that if Barack Obama were to meet me, he would be overjoyed, and we would first set off to have a beer together. We would enjoy that beer, and then we would go outside and shoot hoops. Right? We'd play a game of horse, and we'd laugh and we'd spend time together, and he'd stay for pulled pork, and the family would probably spend the night. We'd all kind of hang out and enjoy each other's company, right? So my person schema about Barack Obama and him desperately being concerned about how my life is, although I think I mean, he seems like a wonderful man to me. He probably doesn't care about what my life is like. Well, maybe that's not true. He probably would care, or at least could act like he cared. But in reality, my person schema for Barack Obama, it's probably not accurate. I'm imagining him as this fun, affable guy who wants nothing more than to, shoot hoops with me and then go have a beer, right? In actuality, he's a high-powered constitutional lawyer who is a former president of the United States, who is a brilliant, brilliant legal and government mind, right? So my cognitive structures about him organize a him that might not exist. And that's the thing to know about person schema, and really all schema. They don't have to be accurate, right? We can have these sets of beliefs about a person, and we expect them to happen, and then sometimes they're not borne out. Some of you probably have had this experience. I don't know if you've ever, and I hope you all do, and I hope it goes swimmingly, and this is a wonderful experience to you. But some of you have had the opportunity to meet your heroes, and after you've met your heroes, you kind of think to yourself, "Ooh, I'm not sure exactly that I want them to be my hero." For those of you, I don't know how many of you have been, well, if you're into sports, really one of the only things that's really exciting and going on right now in the sports world is the documentary series about Michael Jordan, right? Is he the greatest of all time? I have a very strong opinion on this. And I will confess to you that part of my opinion on whether Michael Jordan is the greatest of all time is indeed comes to life primarily because I was a huge Pistons fan between I was growing up at a time when the Pistons were Adrian Dantley um, and Vinny the Microwave and Bill Laimbeer and Dennis Rodman and Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars and all of these guys who didn't get along very well with Michael Jordan and the Bulls. So, but I will spare you from my opinion about whether Michael Jordan's the best. Anyway, um, for those of you who have thought, Michael Jordan's a great guy, has sort of been an experience where the world was let into who Michael Jordan was as a player, and the high personal cost of being as brutally competitive as a man that he was. And don't get me wrong, I respect that about him immensely. So this is a case in which my person's schema for who Michael Jordan was has really had to undergo some real, I like to imagine him as people, they'll show clips of Michael Jordan and he'll, he does the shrug and he'll smile and he'll celebrate, and all of those things are true about him. But what people probably didn't understand was just how incredibly competitive of a person he was. So many cases we've got this situation where our person schema for Michael Jordan, if you have been watching this series through ESPN about Michael Jordan, you might have had to call into question some of the things that you previously thought. Maybe you were exactly right and you just got this about him. So person schema do not have to be accurate necessarily, and but they can be accurate, right? We can have person schema about close others, and we can have person schema about people that we just have never even met, right? It's also the case that we have some self schema, right? So a set of structures that organize our conceptions about our own qualities and characteristics. Now, just like every other kind of schema, self schema are not always accurate. And so this is actually a tricky thing. So many times people just have an inaccurate conception of who they are as people, right? You've probably met people like this. People who think they're just the best thing since sliced bread, and in reality, not a whole lot of people can stand being around them. Um, that's self schema can be accurate as well, but they aren't always accurate 100% of the time. You would think people know their own qualities and characteristics, but it turns out uh, that at least it's true that there's some conflict between self schema and what other people believe about you from time to time, right? There's also something called role schema. Role schema, again, are structures that organize our conception about which behaviors are typical of persons occupying a particular role in society, right? Um, let's see, what's a good example? Oh, you probably, if I tell you that my dad is a pastor, which is true, we covered that. My dad is a pastor. You probably have a certain set of beliefs about what he's like, right? The things that he does. When you imagine the things my dad does, you probably are imagining he gets up on Sunday mornings and he usually gives a sermon or a homily or something of that nature, all of which would be accurate. But to me, my dad is not primarily a pastor. He's my dad. And for that reason, we do things like go out to the bar from time to time to have a beer. Now, that probably is not one of the first things that you think of. That's not your first role schema belief. When you think of pastor, you're not imagining out at the bar. For those of you who are religious, and if you go out to spend the night at Harper's, or decide to get neck deep in foam at Rick's or something like that, although those days are probably behind us. I shudder to think about the disease transmission in a place like that. Um, but don't panic for those of you who are like dying to go um, rub up against each other in foam. I'm sure that you'll have your chance again once there's a vaccine developed. Good news on that. Anyway, um, so if you were to walk into Rick's and you ran into a rabbi or a priest or a pastor or something of that nature, you might be a little surprised. And the reason you'd probably be surprised is that the behavior that you're observing from this person does not align with your role schema for that person. Okay. Another type of schema is a special type of schema called an event schema. An event schema. This is not a schema about a person, but it is a schema about important recurring events. This is what you do when you go to these events. I'll give you an example. Also, this is called a script. Another word for this is a script. I'll give you a brief example, and pardon me, I don't have a great singing voice, so forgive me if this is just not music to your ears. But imagine yourself, you're in a room, there are several of your friends also in that room. All of a sudden, you hear da dun da dun da dun da dun. What do you do? Now, if you're like me, you know what's going on very quickly, right? And what you do when you get those cues is informed by your knowledge of the script at a wedding, right? So when you hear "Here comes the bride," you know that you're supposed to stand up, turn around, and face the bride as she walks down the aisle, right? That's because we have a script for what happens at a wedding, right? I am going to pause you. I will be right back. Port needs to go on. Okay, and we're back. Sorry about that. So we had just been talking about event schema. And then finally, we have something called a group schema, right? And the more popular name of group schema is one that you're familiar with probably. It's a stereotype. For those of you who have been following along closely, you probably thought to yourself, wow, these really sort of sound like forms of prejudice. And that's actually precisely what schema are. Now, um, I want you to hear me very carefully. Most group schema, they're harmful group schema that arise from racist beliefs. And that stuff is messed up and needs to be actively fought against. So with what I'm going to say next, I don't want you to hear me saying that racism is okay. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. It's the opposite of what I'm trying to say. What I will say, though, is that there are many schema that are helpful more than they are harmful, right? We've got tons and tons of ways in which life would be a lot harder if every time you went to a wedding and you heard dun 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 dun, if you didn't know what to do, things would be a lot more uncomfortable. The idea that we have shared sets of beliefs about how to dress at a funeral, right? If you were the only one who didn't know that you're supposed to wear dark clothing to mourn the loss of a loved one at a funeral, and so you came in some sort of rainbow getup, people are probably going to look at you and think that, wow, that's really disrespectful, right? So the fact that we have schema, even though some of them are used for bad things, doesn't make all schema bad. However, there are instances, of course, that schema can be harmful and really need to be actively fought against. Stereotypes where we assume all members of a group are one way, or assume people of a group have some characteristic, even if there's some variance, or that characteristic is just plain not true. These are particularly harmful. Okay. Um, I'll also mention just briefly the idea of prototypes and stereotypes. So a stereotype is a little bit different than a prototype. When we talk about a prototype, we mean rather than a set of beliefs about a specific group, we mean when we talk about a prototype, the one shining example of that group. Now, I think I have. It looks like I don't have that slide here. If you thought, let me give you an example. Let's see. Um, if I asked you to think of a college professor, you might have a certain set of beliefs, right? One thing you might, and I asked you to describe them, many of you would describe a man. Um, Probably not everyone, but many of you would describe an older white man um, wearing probably some sort of khakis and a button-down shirt and gray hair. And this fits our prototypical example. Is this true of everyone? Absolutely not, right? There's tons and tons of people of all races and genders and sexes are college professors. It's not all just white men, right? But that may be our prototypical example, right? The problem comes in when we start to make inferences from our prototypical example to the broader group. When we do that, we're stereotyping, right? So stereotyping involves inferring from your one cognitive example of a group member and applying those characteristics to the whole group. Okay. So in relationships, there are often times that there are biases. And one of these biases that I'd like to talk about is the primacy effect. It turns out that in relationships, we often remember first time something happened really, really well. For those of you who are in a long-term romantic relationship, you probably remember your first kiss with your partner, right? I remember actually, yes, I do remember my first kiss with my wife. It was on her, fittingly, on her love seat at her apartment or a house that she was shared with her roommates, which made this, because it was out in the living room, pretty awkward. If I had it to do all over again, I probably would have not kissed my wife for the first time on her couch in a room where one of her roommates was making cookies in the kitchen without a wall in between us. Awkward choice on my part. But I remember that very well, right? Um, Remembering firsts is a common human tendency, and that's called the primacy effect. We tend to retain those things that happen early on in relationships quite well. Um, I will. Another example of this is I can tell you, I can't tell you much about what happened during Liam, my son's first 2 years of life. I mean, I remember it. And sometimes, Jen and I will remember a specific episode when it happened, but I don't remember all of the details that well. I remember the day he was born very well. I woke up to a phone call from my wife at 3:30 in the morning. I was in graduate school at Michigan State at the time, in the Department of Communication, actually, getting my PhD. And during the week, I lived with one of my colleagues, Kyle, who is, still a good friend. I woke up, I got a phone call, and Jen said, "Well, my water broke. It's time to go." And so I got in the car. Kyle popped his head out of his bedroom and asked, "Is it time?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And I got in the car and I drove back to Grand Rapids from East Lansing. And my wife and I hung out all day. She was in labor all day for, oh, must have been um, close to 5 or 6 hours of pushing. Wasn't great. At the end, we decided we were going to go the less old-fashioned way, and she had a C-section. When Liam came out, there were some concerns, actually. In fact, he was not breathing well. Now, knowing now what I know about childbirth, it turns out that he was probably going to be fine the whole time. But Jen and I didn't know this. He came out looking pretty blue. He did not have like normal color. And I remember so clearly every breath that he was trying to, he had to struggle to take it. So for those of you who don't know, when you deliver a child by cesarean section, rather than through the birth canal, what the birth canal does, there's not a whole lot of room in there. And so it actually often helps the infant to expectorate amniotic fluid and stuff like that from their lungs. And sometimes they can, get some of that in their lungs, and that can cause an infection, especially if, like Liam, they defecate in the womb, which that was not great either. But so, long story short, the whole experience was a difficult one, and they swooped Liam up. They took a couple photographs, which are, to me to this day, still the saddest photographs I have of Liam, because I didn't know when they walked him out on a cart quickly out of that room, I didn't know if he was going to live or if he was going to die. And then they took Jen and I to a recovery room, and I hung out with her there. And for 2 hours, we heard nothing. We didn't know if our son was alive or not. And I remember that like it was yesterday. This is all because of the primacy effect. We remember first things really well. Over time, if you can kind of take a peek at my pointer here. So early on, we remember things really well, but in the meantime, there's some downtime kind of in the middle, and our attention starts to wane. And in relationships as well, there's some downtime. We remember also, though, the stuff that happens very recently, and this is called a recency effect. We remember things that happened a long time ago, the first things really well. We remember the things that just happened really well. But we kind of have a blind spot for the stuff that happens in the middle. If I'm being really honest with you, it's probably a good thing that I can't remember Liam being a toddler very well. And I can promise you that it will be a very good thing that I can't remember him being a teenager really well, because wow. For those of you who are parents or who will be parents, there's an easy spot. Like you get to when a kid is like 6 or 7, like it's all kind of like easy and they're fun and they still like think you're cool. And then they become teenagers, and then they start to get their own ideas, and then it gets harder again. I trust that it will get better eventually. So primacy and recency. Other biases in relationship, we can have something called the confirmation bias. So what the confirmation bias essentially is that we tend to look for information that supports what we already believe. That's the confirmation bias. We look for information that supports what we already believe, and we tend to discount information that would contradict our beliefs about a person. So in social relationships, this can lead to sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I want to briefly talk about a study by 3 scholars that was conducted, I would say approximately in the late 1970s, 1976, 1977, in that ballpark. And the scholars' names are Snyder, Tankey, and Burscheid. To me, one of the most interesting psychology and really sort of communication studies. that's ever been done. Again, just my opinion. I think it's a good one though. So, what Schneider, Tanke, and Burscheid were interested in was the degree to which these confirmation biases and self-fulfilling prophecies actually could be demonstrated to have a real effect on human relationships going forward. Okay. So what they did was they got pairs, dyads, two different people, one male, one female, to come into the lab. And they had an actual lab, and the participants did not see each other before they got into the lab. And so what happened was the male and female got to their own little room, their own little cubicle, and they filled out a little survey just to kind of talk about themselves. And the two people were told, you're going to have a get to know you conversation, just a regular conversation like two people have when they want to get to know one another, right? And at the end of that, the women were told, oh, and by the way, we're going to take your picture so that we have something to show to your partner. Um, and um, and so that's what's going on. They told the men the same thing. They took a picture of the man, they took a picture of the woman. Okay. Now, that picture was a ruse. It was not actually the photograph that the male and female were shown. The male was shown a photograph either of a really, really attractive woman or a really, really unattractive woman, right? And the men, actually, no, that's not the way it worked. The men had no knowledge of the photograph, or pardon me, the men, let me go back. I apologize. I made a mistake there, and I want to be clear. I'll start at the beginning. The men were told that the women would see a photograph of them. So the men had a Polaroid photograph taken of them. The women didn't know anything about the photograph, right? So there was no Polaroid, but the men were told, hey, we're going to take a quick Polaroid photo of you, and we're going to show that to your partner. And then it made sense to the men that they would also be getting this picture. The women were not told about the photograph, and they saw no photograph of their partner. Okay, and that's actually fairly important. So the women's behavior was not based on any mental picture that they had based on a photograph of the men. But for the men who saw either this really, really attractive or really, really unattractive photograph, they kind of could start to see how the confirmation bias might be active. And so if you were partners with a really attractive person, the scholar suspected, hey, I wonder if these people are going to actually be able to elicit behavior from their female partner that confirms their expectations about that person, either being attractive or unattractive. So the way that this happens is a perceiver forms an expectancy. So in this case, the man forms an expectancy of how the woman is going to behave. And then the perceiver acts in a way so that they can get their expectations confirmed, right? The target then notices this and responds in kind, right? So the interesting finding from this study, when they looked at the actual behavior of the women whose male partner was shown an attractive photograph behaved in a way that trained coders later said, listen, they behaved in a more attractive way. And those whose male partner was shown an unattractive photograph behaved in a way that was judged by trained coders to be unattractive. In other words, what happened was the male was able to alter the behavior of his female partner just by the way he interacted with her. absolutely fascinating study that demonstrates the effect that a confirmation bias can have, the effect that if you believe a conversation with a person is going to go badly, you may well behave in a way to get that conversation to go badly. If you believe that a conversation is going to go well, you probably behave in a way to make that conversation go well, right? This is really important to understand when it comes to job interviews, when it comes to, if you're starting a romantic relationship, the things that you believe about how your partner will respond to you are going to have an effect on the way that they're actually going to respond to you, right? Um, so kind of an interesting study that illustrates this confirmation bias. And I think it's interesting because although it was done, these are psychologists who did this work. This is clearly a communication study, right? All of the magic is happening in the way the communication of my beliefs about you have an effect on this relationship. This is one of the big reasons we care about social cognition, right? Because what we think, our cognitions, our thoughts, the stuff that goes on in our noggin is going to have an effect on the way other people are going to respond to you and the way you interact with them. Interesting stuff to me. If you have questions about that, and I kind of botched my first part of the explanation. I went back and we've got it all corrected, but feel free to ask questions about that in the discussion forum for today. If you have any questions. If you don't have any questions, you don't have to ask. This is a good question also to reflect on in the discussion forum for the lecture today. Can you think of any examples when you've either been the perpetrator or a victim of a self-fulfilling prophecy? We probably all have this thing happen to us, either as a perpetrator or a victim. It makes sense for us to kind of think about it. So if any of you can think of good examples of when this has happened for you, feel free to share. Other biases that we can have in relationships, positive illusions. We can imagine things to be better than they otherwise are. And in fact, early on in relationships, or often in relationships, people have these positive illusions. I want to briefly talk about attributions. Attributions, very simply, are explanations we generate for why things happen. So humans are curious creatures in that we are forever trying to figure out why things occurred. And I guess it's not all that curious. Once we figure out why things happen, we have a better idea of how to stop them from happening in the way that they, in some undesirable way that they happened in the past, or how to keep good things happening to you. This is why we care so much about the why question. Why do we try to attribute things to certain causes? Because it helps us to know how the world will play out in the future, right? So in our relationships, we also make these kinds of attributions, and there are a number of different characteristics of the um, number of different characteristics of attribution. Sometimes the attributions we make vary in terms of whether they're internal or external attributions. So let's say this didn't happen, but let's say for a second it did. Jen and I got into a big fight this morning because let's see, what's a good example? Because when I woke up, I had said that I was going to take out the trash last night, and I just didn't. So Jen trying to figure out what's going on here with me, because she wants to be able to control her world, and she, would like me to be an active participant in taking care of the household. And so she could sort of make, when she answers the question why, why did Brandon forget to take out the trash? She could answer that question in a couple of different ways. If she were to make an internal attribution, she would say something like this: Brandon forgot to take out the trash because he's a bad person. Bad people don't care about their spouse enough to take care of these simple household chores that they're asked to do. He didn't do it, and he didn't do it because he's a bad person, right? So she's saying that the reason that you didn't take out the trash is because there's a problem with you, right? She also could have said, and I hope she would say, if I forgot to take out the trash, Brandon was really busy with these two other projects and he was working on some writing last night. And for that reason, he just forgot, right? It's not because he's a bad person. It's because there's a whole lot going on in his life and he just forgot to do this thing, right? That would be an external attribution. She's not saying that there's something wrong with me personally inside. What she's saying is there's something going on in the world around Brandon that made him less attentive than he could have been in this one instance, right? So attributions can vary in terms of whether they're an internal or external attribution. She could also have attributions about that same instance that varied in terms of their stability. So even if she made an external attribution and said Brandon has a lot going on in his life, and he just forgot, it's kind of not his fault, and so perhaps that's what's going on. But he almost always has a lot going on in his life, right? That would be sort of a stable attribution. So he has a lot going on. It's an external attribution, but he really, he kind of always has a lot going on. And so this behavior with him forgetting to take out the trash, it's probably not going to change. That would be a stable attribution. An unstable attribution would be her saying, he does have a lot going on in his life right now, but this weekend, I think probably things are going to calm down. I know he had, a couple of these article reviews to do and send off to journals for editors, and so that was probably what was really holding him up, and probably what made him forget. I don't think this is likely to keep happening, right? That would be an unstable attribution. In other words, things change. Things are going to change about this particular behavior, and it's not going to happen all the time. Finally, another characteristic is the controllability of an attribution, right? So if Jen said, it would be hard for me to imagine using this example, that any attribution she could come up with would be not controllable. In this case, I absolutely have control about whether I remember to take out the trash or not. And so probably she would say, even if this is caused by him just being busy, he still has control over his memory. Now, if I was an absolute scatterbrain, she might say something like this: I've seen this about Brandon. This is a stable characteristic, and I think he actually is trying to remember to take out the trash. It's just that he is so crap at remembering to do things, at any things, that he just doesn't have control over whether he remembers to do these household tasks I ask him to do. That would be an attribution of uncontrollability. That is, I don't have control over whether this happens or not, right? So we can have attribution biases, and this is where things really start to get interesting. First, the self-serving bias suggests that when we do a bad thing, if I do a bad thing in my relationship, let's say Jen asked me to empty the dishwasher. No, that's not my job. That's Liam's job. Let's say Jen asked me to remember to take out the trash, because we've been using that example, and that could happen. Um, and I forget to do it, right? I can make attributions about that and what that means about myself as well, right? Um, the self-serving bias suggests that if I do a bad thing, I am going to be more likely to explain my behavior according to an external attribution. In other words, what I'll say is, I did forget, I did this bad thing, but there were a whole bunch of external factors that led into me doing this bad thing. In other words, I've got a ton of excuses that aren't me just being an idiot for why I forgot to take out the trash. I would be more likely, in using the self-serving bias, to say about myself that this is an unstable behavior. I guess I did this bad thing this one time, but usually I'm a good guy. Usually I do things to make my wife happy, regardless of whether that's true or not, right? That's probably what I would say. And that's an example of the self-serving bias. And in terms of controllability, I might make an argument that I really just don't have control over this, right? This is not a thing that, it's not my fault because I can't control this about myself. So in the self-serving bias, we make these kinds of attributions about ourselves when we do bad stuff. When we do stuff, not even like bad, like not like super bad stuff, but just like even when we're moderately annoying as people, we identify this, and we don't want to have to think about ourselves that we're just bad people. Now, some people do that too, right? If you've got very low self-esteem, often people, and you make a mistake in life, you're likely to say about yourself, no, I'm just a bad person, and I'm always a bad person, and I do have control, and I still choose to do the wrong thing, right? There are some people like that. Um, all of those attributions are probably also a bias, because it's almost always not the truth that there's anybody who's just like truly bad, who does bad stuff to a partner, because deep down they are a black-hearted, awful, terrible human, right? That's not reality. The fundamental attribution error occurs when, instead of thinking about a behavior that I've done, or a bad thing that I've done, there's a bad thing that my partner has done, right? According to the fundamental attribution error, when my partner does a bad thing, I'm way more likely to say it's an internal problem. Jen is just annoying, like she was passive aggressive in this conversation I had. She's just a passive aggressive person. She's a bad person. This is a stable characteristic. It drives me nuts every time. And I know she's doing it on purpose. She's got control over this. It's not that she doesn't hear it, or doesn't think about it much beforehand. She knows what she's doing, right? That's the fundamental attribution error. Almost always, it's not the case that people are doing these things. There's usually a little bit of truth to both sides of an attributional explanation, right? There's a little bit of internal, a little bit of external, but the fundamental attribution error suggests that we tend to make internal, stable, and controllable attributions about other people, but the self-serving bias says we tend to make external, unstable, and uncontrollable attributions about ourselves. So in relationships, and we'll kind of talk about this just briefly today, um, the state of a couple's relationship, and you can actually tell a lot about your relationship. Now, I'm not a relationship counselor, and so I want to preempt this by saying that. But with that said, there are some ways to tell if you're in a relationship that has some red flags. It doesn't mean if you see some of these red flags that your relationship is just over. Don't freak out and leave your partner because there are a couple bad things, maybe patterns that you engage in. But in general, happy couples um, tend to engage in relationship enhancing kinds of behaviors. And so if your partner does something good, you tend to think of that behavior, that good behavior, as an internal, stable, and global controllable behavior, right? So if your partner does a nice thing, you if your partner maybe goes out and buys you flowers, you think, well, that's because she or he is just a good person, and she or he is pretty much like this all the time, and and this kind of good behavior exists in other parts of their lives too, right? If that's the way you make that's those are the kinds of attributions you make about your partner's positive behavior, and your partner's negative behavior, you tend to say, well, yeah, he he did this bad thing, but or she did this bad thing, but gosh, he or she is undergoing a lot of stress in their life right now, and for that reason, I kind of understand why they're behaving in the way that they are. And they're not usually like this. It's really just right now. It's very specific to this time, certainly not all parts of their life. If you engage in patterns, attributional patterns like those, you're probably in a pretty healthy relationship. It does not mean that your partner always does good stuff, right? People of all stripes all the time make mistakes in relationships. And you are if you're in a close personal romantic relationship, you know this. You know that your partner's not perfect. Unhappy couples, though, engage in almost exactly the opposite kinds of attributions. And when you do that, we really see that this functions to maintain distress in people's lives. So if your partner does a good thing, and you think, I wonder what she or he did wrong that they feel like they have to go do this good thing. I wonder what other factors. I wonder who told them they were being a jerk to me most of the time, and so that's why they did this. That's why he or she got me flowers. It's because they did something wrong, and they felt like this external force forced them to do this. They're not always like this. This is probably specific just to this one part of their life. On the other hand, if your partner does something negative and you find yourself thinking, well, this is just the way it is with this particular person, you're really functioning to maintain distress within the relationship. If you find that that is usually the way you're interacting with a significant other, if or the way they're interacting with you, I have to tell you that there are probably happier relationships that you can be in. It could be that the current relationship you're in can be happier, right? And it could just be about talking about the way that you maintain distress or you enhance your relationship, and thinking about things differently. It could be that that's enough. Um, Either way, don't panic. If you do a few bad things from time to time, right? If you engage in some distress maintaining behavior, it's not the end of the world, but it is a thing to think about. We can also have biases about ourselves, our self concept, our self perceptions. I'll talk just briefly about these. I will tell you, I'm not going to ask a lot about this information on the first exam, just because I think that when we get to talking about self enhancement versus self verification, that's a thing that is discussed at length in your book, but again, I didn't require the book, and so rather than creating this other thing, I'm not going to ask about self perceptions as I've got them written here on this PowerPoint slide on the test. I will mention briefly, though, about self-concept. Self-concept is sort of an interesting creature. Um, People's self-concepts, we have biases in our self-concept, right? Um, that is, the way that we think about ourselves as humans is rarely 100% accurate. Some of you have experienced or are struggling with, and I'm not asking you to share these stories publicly with your classmates. It's one of the beauties of being able to do this online, and I have never seen most of you, so I don't know for sure, but my guess is some of you have struggled with things like eating disorders, right? Often a part of an eating disorder is that a person believes not true things about the shape of their body. It's called body dysmorphia, right? So when we believe that our body is different than the actual corporeal reality that we have going on, that is a bias in our self-concept, right? The way we think about ourselves is not true. People with very low self-esteem often come to the conclusion that they're not worth, loving. And that just fundamentally goes against everything I believe about human beings. I think that everybody is worth loving and caring about, even yourself. Um, and so sometimes we can start to think, boy, I'm not worthwhile person. You see bad stuff that you've done in your life, and you think, I don't know, I'm just not a person worth caring about, right? That's a bias. You are a person worth caring about. And those can be, particularly problematic when people, especially when people have very low self-esteem, because what will often happen is that the people that you share those low self-esteem beliefs with don't like hearing that about you. First of all, they're inconsistent with their own schema that they have for you. And so these biases can be troubling. Now, it's also not the case that the only self biases people can have are negative ones, right? It's not just that we believe that we weigh more than we should, or even that we weigh more than we do, or that we're bad people. Sometimes, you probably know a few of these people too. There are some people who think, ah, I am the best thing since sliced bread. I am so great. Everyone should love being around me. We think of these people, we know them as narcissists, right? And if you think people don't like being around people with low self-esteem, people really don't like being around people with overly high self-esteem, who think that they are just the best, God's gift to humankind, right? You could probably think a few of those people too. These are biases as well that can harm the way we interact with close personal relationships. So these biases really do function to go both ways. I'm going to finish off today talking a little bit about impression management. This is not an exhaustive list of impression management strategies, by the way. I want to briefly talk about impression management simply as a thing that we do. And we've got a number of strategies to do it. One would be ingratiation, right? So one of the things that we often use to get people to do things for us is we manage their impression of us so that we seem like people who have done things for them, right? Um, Ingratiation is a very commonly used strategy to get people to do things for us. And that makes it sound as if people are just out there to get, what's good for them. Ingratiation can be used for a number of things. I mean, to be really honest with you, when I started dating my wife, I used all sorts of ingratiation strategies to get her to, don't get crazy here with what I mean. Um, I used tons of ingratiation strategies so that she would just say yes to a second date with me, right? I did all sorts of things to I first of all, I paid for coffee that first night, right? Um, which made her feel gratitude, and um, and it made her feel like, yeah, maybe I could go out for coffee with him again, right? Not a huge evil strategy, but one that I used to my romantic advantage in that particular case. By the way, I don't go through life um, trying to trying to figure out how to win at romantic relationships with my wife. I'm using that in sort of cold scientific language um, to, I use this strategy to make her like me more, right? I didn't really think about it at the time, but it worked. Self promotion. For those of you who are still on social media, which I actually am a recent convert, I am no longer on social media just because it, there were a few things that it just wasn't good for me. Um, but you probably know people who engage in this kind of impression management all the time, which is, very simply, say good things about yourself. Tell people what you're up to and promote you, right? And that's another form of impression management. Supplication, to actually give people things. There's sort of a fine line between ingratiation and supplication, but that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about supplication. Another form of impression management, although not gratefully not commonly used in romantic and personal relationships, is intimidation. For those of you who are athletes, um, you are probably quite aware of the way intimidation can function, right? Um, Both because it has probably hampered you and because you probably tried to use it in certain scenarios to your benefit. Um, I think that this is probably another instance of fun stuff that I've watched or learned from about Michael Jordan from this new uh, short series about his life and career. Uh, he used intimidation just like a boss. I forget who it was or which game of the series it was. Um, now I'm thinking of LeBron James. Never mind. At any rate, uh, Michael Jordan uses tons of intimidating tactics to to manage his impression, and he did it on the court, and he has done it elsewhere as well. So I'll just kind of briefly throw this up on the screen and use this as an example to say this. Um, when when we engage in impression management, we often use different strategies for different scenarios. Right? We don't, obviously, you're not going to use intimidation all the time. When you ask your parents for money, supplication's usually not going to work. Because your parents, if they're the ones who have the money and you want to get it from them, giving them something else, it doesn't, ingratiation, making them feel good, or doing something, a small favor for them, that actually might work pretty well. But there are many strategies of impression management that we can use. When we ask our parents for money, when we create or edit a social media account, when we go to hang out with another person for the first time, um, lots and lots of different ways to do impression management. And so you can think about which strategy you might find the most useful for these different actions that we can do. Okay, with that, I am going to end this particular episode. I want to thank you guys for hanging out with me and for putting up with me while my pork was on the smoker. I will let you know how things turned out. Although it's going to have to be next week because I won't have any final answers for you before that point. Um, today I will post this video. Tomorrow I will likely post the attraction episode, as well as I very much hope um, to get you your final assignment. If I don't have your final assignment to you out tomorrow, I will have it out to you sometime in the next upcoming week. So also I will say it's not a, I don't think that that should be a thing that you should panic about at this time. There will be still plenty of time for you to be able to focus and work on that final assignment. I do want to get it out to you in the next week, but if it's in week 3, that you'll still have plenty of time to do the assignment well. Okay, with that, I will say have a great day. It's been fun. We'll talk next time.